An ArchaeoDeath publication review.
Yes, it's me again. Hello, Archaeodeathlings. It's Professor Howard Williams here to tell you about yet another book. Now, as you can see, I've been quite prolific with my edited collections. This is the first one stemming from my University of Chester facilitated archaeology student conferences. Now, since 2016, we've been organising these annual facilitated conferences where the students do the organisation. I help them. We give them guidance on how to prepare and how to deliver a presentation, how to invite speakers, how to sort it all out, and they deliver a day conference. And the first 5 are all real world events at the Grosvenor Museum in Chester, and they're recorded, they're online. Check my ArchaeoDeath blog for details, or find them on Vimeo, YouTube, I think, and also they all had students created websites and so on for them. And the idea is that this is part of a course called Archaeology in Contemporary Society, where they explore the politics, pop cultures and engagements of archaeology in the real world, in the contemporary environment, from everything from the repatriation and reburial debates, working with and negotiating and combating fringe and alternative pseudo-archaeological narratives, right the way through to issues of career development and the future of archaeology as a discipline. And each year the conferences aim for them to do some research on a specific theme, and we started off with a theme I had already addressed in a 2016 book with Dr. Melanie Giles on archaeologists and the dead, and you can check out the video about that book. We thought we'd repeat that, but try to fill in gaps, and we produced a book stemming from the conference, and it's co-edited. Here's the physical copy of the book. Co-edited with Ben Wills-Eve, who's now a doctoral researcher at the University of Lancaster, I believe. He started his doctoral research at Chester and then jumped ships. I still talk to him, but that's his, not much. And Jenny Osborne, who's one of the students who put a lot of effort into organising the conference itself. And so it took 2.5 years to produce, which is not bad for an edited collection. And we worked with Equinox Press, and here's their website where you can buy it. And they produce a really high quality piece of work. Really is smart. And I want to, as well as thanking my co-editors, I want to point out that this book, which is only 2 years old, so it's still fresh. The smell of fresh book. Sorry, I have to indulge in a bit of book sniffing. It's a dirty habit, but someone's got to do it. Where was I? Can't remember. Who knows? Oh yes, and it's got a wonderful front cover image, and this comes from one of the books in the volume itself, by Leszek Gidea, and Leszek gave us permission. I think the artist gave us permission, because the art is by Miroslav Kuzma, and his article, his chapter looks at a collaboration between Leszek, who's an archaeologist, and Miroslav to produce reconstructions of, you can see it better there, reconstructions of Viking Age graves, and attempts to put the flesh back on the bones, and it's a fantastic paper. Anyway, so that's what the front cover's about. And the book contains a mixture of original studies by the students themselves, those that wanted to participate from the 2016 conference called Dead Relevant, writing up their papers, and some papers by myself and colleagues and heritage practitioners. We've got a wonderful foreword by Dr. Jodie Lewis, who was our former external examiner, and she outlines the importance of the topic and of the value of getting students to be researchers. I then produce an introduction called Dead Relevant, introducing the public archaeology of death. We then have a case study chapter of field archaeology involving volunteers and visitors in a cemetery excavation. And the St Patrick's Chapel excavation project, public engagement with the rescue excavation of an early medieval cemetery in southwest Wales, was authored by Marion Shiner, Katie A. Hemer and Rhiannon Cummo. and together they present the work at St Patrick's Chapel by Dyfed Archaeological Trust in collaboration with the University of Sheffield and others to engage thousands of visitors in an excavation of an early Christian or an early medieval cemetery. So that's a wonderful contribution. Then there's a chapter by my now doctoral researcher Suzanne Evans, Death's Diversity on Display, all the Ds, the case for Llangollen Museum. In other words, what we do, and I've talked about this in a separate YouTube video, so I'll leave this for you to go and look at, about how small museums can incorporate memorials and mortuary archaeologies from many different times and places within a small space, and that crystallises a very different relationship between death and the dead within the museum. So that's a really interesting chapter, I think, looking at Llangollen Museum, where the monument, the Pillar of Elyseg, which is one of my favourite monuments that I was involved in the excavations and Suzanne was involved in the field work, is its replica takes centre stage within the museum. And so we have an example here of a whole museum space dedicated or focused around not only the replica but then also subsequently the cremated remains that we uncovered during our excavations. So the excavations are fed directly into the museum display and how death has a prominent place within that museum. The next chapter is another co-authored chapter, but this time moving from museums and fieldwork, we move to a heritage site, and a very distinctive one, namely Sutton Hoo, managed by the National Trust. And Madeline Walsh, one of the students, and myself present a critique of the Sutton Hoo Visitor Centre as it was before its redevelopment of last year, and its display of the deviant dead, in other words the sand bodies on display in the museum. So this book takes to task and critiques the way in which we actually have lots of positive things to say about the museum display, but we also sort of say some of the challenges of almost a landscape with the dead inhabit but haunt it in a ghostly fashion because there's no skeletal remains, or very little skeletal remains preserved. So we have cenotaphic and ghostly shadows of the dead which haunt the landscape, and so we discuss the experience of visiting and engaging with the funerary remains at Sutton Hoo. Then Sian Murray does a doctoral researcher at Durham at the time, now finished her PhD, so Dr. Sian Murray, now Dr. Sian James, has a paper called Grave Expectations, Body Posture in Popular and Museum Representations. So she looks at not only Sutton Hoo but also popular TV and film representations of the cadaver in death, and how we often map our expectations onto the past in so doing. Another original contribution by a student is the chapter by Chiara Bolcini, then an undergraduate of Chester, now a Groningen postgraduate student. She does a critique and evaluation of how popular magazines, current archaeology, current world archaeology, compare and contain the representations of the human dead. So she actually does a sort of critique of popular magazines and how they contain images of the dead. Leisure Gidea then has a chapter, as I said, looking at the representation of the Viking dead and how we can work with artists to create new visualizations of human remains and grave context, putting the flesh on the bones to write different stories and enrich stories about them. And then there's a chapter by me, which I've addressed in another video, with Aaron Watson, looking at cremation, envisioning cremation and how we communicate cremation practices through art. And so I've talked about that in another video. Then we have a chapter by one of the students called Sam Munch, who looks at controversy surrounding human remains from the First World War and other conflicts of the 20th century. And then a fascinating chapter by Rachel Nicholson, another former student, on role-play game, on multiplayer online role-play games and multiplayer online battle arenas. And massively multiplayer online role-playing games, and yeah, so in other words, stuff that happens online, video games and stuff. And she looks at a series of games and the ways in which death and the dead are experienced in this digital world. And then the final chapter is by me, and given I've just seen the end of season 6 of the TV show Vikings, this is my exploration of the TV show's funerals, seasons 1 to 4. So I look at cremation practices in the show, inhumation practices, and the treatment of the dead and the disposal of the dead in the TV show. And before we have a final afterword, the Public Archaeology of Death, Emotion, Equality in the Student Experience by Dr. Karina Croucher, who writes a really inspiring sort of synopsis of the significance of the pedagogy and of engaging students with mortality and deathly subjects. So that's my little review of the Public Archaeology of Death. Smells good, looks good, doesn't smell of the dead. You can buy it in any shop or online through the Equinox website. I hope that video has been a useful introduction for you into yet another of my academic publications. And while it has a hardback cover price, I think it's an important contribution to ongoing debates that are of global significance, although the case studies are UK and European in focus, concerning how we dispose of the dead, how we deal with death and the dead in our public engagement, the different strategies of envisioning, how we critique popular culture representations, how our heritage sites and museums and fieldwork deal with mortality. Thanks very much.
Sadly, we're all going to die. But while you're waiting, why not follow ArchaeoDeath? Subscribe now on YouTube.